By Thursday night, she had 3 potatoes left. 7 days until payday. The kitchen was dim, just one bulb burning above the stove, casting long shadows across a worn wooden table where a ration book lay open like a small, exhausted Bible. Outside, rain moved steadily against the glass. Inside, something thin and pale simmered on the back burner. More water than soup, honestly. But it smelled like effort. It smelled like love refusing to quit. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, and she was doing the math again. Not with a calculator, not with an app, with a stubby pencil, a sheet of paper already soft from being folded and unfolded too many times, and a mind that had learned to treat every single penny like it had a name. 3 children upstairs, a husband working doubles at the factory, a pantry that echoed when you opened it too quickly. She saved the bacon grease in a tin beside the stove. She boiled vegetable peels into broth. She made bread pudding from slices so stale they could have been used for carpentry. She stretched one soup bone across 4 days, like a musician playing the same note in 4 completely different ways. People would call these things clever now. Back then, Eleanor just called it Tuesday. But here's what nobody talks about, what the history books always skip over. It wasn't just the food that nearly broke her. It was the invisible weight of pretending every single evening that dinner was enough, that everything was fine, that the children didn't need to worry. Because they were watching her face more than they were watching their plates. What happened inside that tiny rationing kitchen would quietly change everything about how her family survived. Because her real story didn't start with abundance. It started with almost nothing left. The kitchen smelled like yesterday's soup and this morning's worry. Eleanor Marsh stood at the counter with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. 41 years old, 3 children sleeping upstairs, a husband whose paycheck had already been mentally divided 11 different ways before it even arrived. Outside, rain tapped against the window like it was asking to be let in. She didn't move. The ration book sat open on the table beside a notepad covered in her handwriting, numbers crossed out, rewritten, crossed out again. Sugar stamps, butter stamps, the meat allowance that somehow had to stretch across 14 dinners. She'd done this math 3 times already. It never got more generous. The refrigerator hummed quietly. She didn't open it. She already knew what was inside. Half a block of lard, 2 eggs, a bowl of last night's bean soup with a cloth draped over it. Enough for today, maybe. Tomorrow required a different kind of thinking entirely. Her youngest, Danny, had asked for pancakes at breakfast. She'd smiled and told him Sunday. She wasn't sure Sunday would cooperate. Across the street, Mrs. Paulson had planted her 3rd row of beans last week. Eleanor had watched from this same window, telling herself she'd start her own victory garden when things settled down. But things didn't settle. They just quietly shifted into new shapes of difficult. She picked up her pencil again. 43 cents left in the jar above the stove, $1.12 in her coat pocket. The next ration allotment wouldn't come until Thursday. It was Monday. How did she even plan to feed everyone? She didn't reach for the pencil right away. First, she just stood there, breathing, letting the weight of the numbers sit without immediately trying to fix them. Eleanor had learned, slowly, the hard way, that panicking over a budget never once made it larger. She pulled out the chair at the kitchen table and sat down properly for the first time all morning. The notepad in front of her was divided into 4 columns. Never spend what you haven't already imagined spending. Before any grocery run, she sat exactly like this, pencil moving slowly, crossing off wants, circling needs, deciding in the quiet of the kitchen what dinner would look like 3 days from now, 5 days from now, planning meals backward from whatever scraps remained at week's end. It felt tedious, sometimes it felt humiliating, but it worked. She wrote beans, cornmeal, 1 can tomatoes, lard if stamps allow. She underlined beans twice. Outside, Danny's voice drifted down the stairs. He was awake. She heard his small feet on the floorboards and felt the familiar urgency of a mother whose morning thinking time had just officially ended. She folded the notepad carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. The math wasn't finished, but she was ready. But the grocery store would test her resolve. The store smelled like sawdust and canned peaches. Eleanor walked in with Danny's hand in hers, and her grocery list folded against her palm like a small shield. She didn't look at the display window items. She'd trained herself out of that habit months ago. Display items with theater. They were meant to make you feel like you were missing something. She wasn't missing anything. She was conserving everything. She moved to the dry goods aisle first. Always dry goods first. Beans, lentils, cornmeal, oats. These were the backbone of the week. Everything else would be built around them. A bag of navy beans could become soup on Monday, a side dish Wednesday, and a cold salad by Friday if she was careful. She weighed the cornmeal bag in her hand, checked the price, set it back, found the slightly larger bag for 3 cents more that would last nearly twice as long. 3 cents. It mattered. Danny tugged her sleeve near the candy display. Just once, quietly. He knew better than to push. She looked down at him and felt the familiar twist behind her ribs. Not guilt exactly, something gentler and heavier at the same time. "Maybe Saturday," she said. He nodded like he believed her. She moved to the vegetable section. Cabbage, onions, carrots, the older ones, slightly soft, marked down 2 cents per pound. Perfect. Soft carrots made better soup anyway. She'd learned it accidentally one November and never forgotten it. At the meat counter, she used exactly half her remaining stamps. A soup bone with a modest amount of meat still clinging to it. It would cook low and slow. It would become 3 meals before it was done. She counted her change at the counter. Twice. But groceries weren't the biggest threat. It was the gas bill that caught her sideways. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a small envelope left on the hall table by her husband Thomas before he'd left for his shift, with the amount circled in pencil, and no note beside it, because there wasn't really anything to say. Eleanor picked it up, read the number, set it down. Then she went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove for a long moment, thinking about heat. They cooked everything in batches now. She'd started doing it almost unconsciously, roasting 2 dishes at once whenever the oven was lit, letting the residual heat finish the cornbread while the main pot came off the flame. No sense heating the oven for one thing, no sense wasting the warmth once it was already there. She washed dishes in the smallest amount of hot water that still made sense. She mended the draft gap under the back door with a rolled towel her mother had taught her to call a draft snake. She reminded the children, gently but consistently, that lights went off when you left a room. Thomas didn't always understand why she tracked these things so carefully. He worked hard, and he trusted her with the household management, but sometimes she'd catch him leaving the kitchen light burning, and she'd quietly cross the room and click it off without comment. It wasn't resentment, it was arithmetic. Every penny redirected from utilities was a penny that could become dinner later in the month. This was simply how Eleanor's mind worked now. The household was a system, every part of it connected. She made a note beside the gas bill figure. She'd adjust the cooking schedule, again. The real test arrived halfway through the month. It was Danny's shoe. The sole had separated quietly, probably over several days, and she only noticed when he came inside from the yard with a sock that was more mud than cotton. She turned the shoe over in her hands and stared at it the way you stare at something you were hoping wouldn't happen. Thomas was at work. The children were watching her face the way children always do, looking not at the shoe but at her expression, trying to calculate how serious this was by reading the muscles around her eyes. She kept her face neutral. She was practiced at this. "I'll fix it tonight," she said simply, and set the shoe beside the door. Inside, she was running the numbers before she'd even set it down. Shoe repair would cost something, not catastrophic, but not nothing, and the month was only half finished, which meant the second half, always the harder half, now had a gap in it that hadn't been there that morning. She went to the pantry and stood in front of it with the door open for a long moment. Cornmeal, beans, 4 potatoes, half a can of tomatoes with wax paper pressed across the top, 1 onion, a small paper bag of oats, the soup bone remains wrapped in cloth, already used twice. She closed the pantry door carefully, as if not to disturb anything. In the sitting room, she could hear Danny telling his sister about something, his voice bright and completely unconcerned, the way children's voices are when adults have successfully hidden the weight of things. She was glad for that. She intended to keep it that way. Then she made one decision nobody expected. She knocked on Mrs. Alderman's door that same evening. Ruth Alderman was 63, lived alone, and had a victory garden that had gotten slightly out of hand by August. More tomatoes than one woman could reasonably process, more beans than she had jars for. Eleanor had admired it from across the alley for weeks without saying anything. Tonight, she finally said something. She brought a small loaf of cornbread wrapped in a dish towel. Ruth opened the door, looked at bread, looked at Eleanor, and stepped aside without a word, as if she'd been expecting this conversation for some time. They sat at Ruth's kitchen table for 40 minutes. Eleanor came home with 6 tomatoes, a bunch of dried herbs, more green beans than she could carry in one trip, and something she hadn't expected, a handwritten recipe for a meatless vegetable stew that Ruth said she'd been making since the last war, before this one. She cooked it the following evening. The children ate it without complaint, which, in Eleanor's experience, was the highest possible praise. And then she started thinking differently, not just about food, but about resources. Ruth had surplus. Eleanor had skills. The neighborhood, if you thought about it as a system rather than just a collection of separate houses, had more resilience than any single pantry could manage alone. She began baking extra cornbread twice a week. She left portions for Ruth. Ruth left vegetables on Eleanor's back step in return. Nobody called it trading. Nobody made it formal. But it worked with a quiet efficiency that no grocery store could replicate. Scrap broth appeared every Sunday, vegetable peels, herb stems, the last exhausted remains of any bone.
Nothing left the kitchen without being used once, then twice, then transformed entirely. But pride nearly destroyed everything.
It was Thomas who made the comment without meaning to. He came home one Thursday evening to find Eleanor at the table with Ruth's recipe cards spread beside a note from their neighbor Margaret, who'd offered, kindly, genuinely, to share her remaining sugar stamps. She had no children and baked rarely, and thought Eleanor could use them more practically. Thomas stood in the kitchen doorway reading the situation before he said anything. "We're taking handouts now?" He wasn't cruel about it. He was tired. There's a version of pride that lives in tired men and speaks before it's thought things through properly, and Eleanor recognized it because she'd felt the same thing herself, the same instinct, before she'd learned to examine it. She didn't raise her voice. "Margaret has stamps she won't use," she said carefully. "Our children need sugar for their oatmeal, and I've been giving them less than I should for 3 weeks." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "It's not charity," Eleanor continued, softer now. "It's neighbors being sensible." She watched him work through it, watched the pride and the exhaustion and the love all negotiate with each other behind his eyes. He nodded slowly, once, and didn't bring it up again. But Eleanor sat with her own version of the same feeling long after he'd gone to bed. There was a particular kind of difficulty in asking, in admitting that your careful planning had still come up short, in accepting that intelligence and effort weren't always enough on their own, that sometimes survival required community in ways that felt dangerously close to vulnerability. She accepted Margaret's stamps the next morning. She baked the children proper oatmeal. She didn't explain it to them, she just served it warm. Now only 7 days remained. 7 days. Eleanor spread everything across the kitchen table on a Sunday evening after the children were in bed. This was her ritual now, the weekly accounting done in silence in the only hour that truly belonged to her. She counted what remained. Cornmeal, enough for 4 breakfasts if portioned carefully. A small amount of lard. 1 can of tomatoes, the last one. 6 eggs. She'd been rationing these almost unconsciously. 1 here, 1 there, stretching them across the week like punctuation. 3 potatoes. Dried beans still, a good amount. Ruth's tomatoes, most of them preserved now in jars Eleanor had washed and reused from last season. The ration stamps told a different story. Meat stamps nearly exhausted, butter stamps completely gone. Sugar stamps, thanks to Margaret, still had some life in them. She made a grid on her notepad, Monday through Sunday across the top, breakfast, lunch, dinner down the side. She filled in each square in pencil, working slowly, moving things around. Could the bean soup stretch to Tuesday lunch if she added more water and 1 potato? Yes. Would the children eat cornmeal for 2 mornings in a row? Probably. Danny would make a face. She'd make it anyway. Wednesday was the hardest square. She stared at it for a long time, then wrote, "Vegetable scrap broth, cornbread, whatever the garden gives." It was an honest answer. Thursday she left blank initially, then remembered the eggs and wrote, "Egg and onion skillet." Not glamorous, genuinely filling. By the time she'd penciled in Sunday, she had a week that worked, barely, carefully, with no room for any new surprises whatsoever. She looked at the grid for a moment. She folded it into her apron pocket. Would the food last or not? It lasted. Not with anything to spare. Not with any dramatic moment of realization or relief. Just a quiet Sunday evening at the end of the month, where Eleanor stood at the stove making the last of the cornmeal into a simple supper, and recognized,
with something more like exhaustion than triumph, that they had made it through. The pot on the stove was thin. The pantry behind her was genuinely empty in a way that would require serious attention come Monday. Thomas would bring his paycheck home in 2 days, and she already had the next ration book open on the table, the next month's planning already begun. She hadn't won anything.
But there was Danny setting the table without being asked, folding the napkins the way she'd shown him, placing each fork with a small, careful seriousness that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. There was her daughter Clara carrying the water pitcher with both hands, concentrating deeply. There was Thomas washing up at the sink, his shoulders looser than they'd been all month. Dinner was cornbread and the last of the vegetable broth, stretched into something that resembled a proper soup if you didn't look at it too critically. Nobody complained. Eleanor stood at the stove and watched her family arrange themselves around the table and felt the specific and unspectacular weight of what had happened this month. The calculations, the adjustments, the quiet negotiations with pride and scarcity, and the unpredictable nature of shoes falling apart at inconvenient times. No one outside that kitchen would ever fully know what it had taken. That somehow felt right. Some kinds of strength don't need an audience. The story doesn't end there, it only becomes more relevant.